Zella Harper was still wearing her hospital scrubs when her entire marriage collapsed in the middle of her dream kitchen. "What do you mean your mother owns the house?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling from exhaustion after a 14-hour ICU shift. Wesley barely looked up from his whiskey glass. "Technically, it's under Mom's name for now." For a second, the world stopped breathing. 5 years, 3 jobs, missed birthdays, sleepless nights. Every overtime shift, every dollar she earned had gone into these walls. Then Diane Whitmore smiled from across the Marble Island and said, "A woman in your position shouldn't concern herself with legal details." Zella felt something inside her crack. Not her heart, her loyalty. If you've ever sacrificed everything for people who secretly plan to leave you with nothing, this story will hit harder than you expect. And by the end, you'll understand why some women stop begging to be loved and start fighting to be respected instead. The first time Zella Harper fell asleep behind the wheel of her car, she was 29 years old and parked outside St. Vincent Medical Center at 3:40 in the morning. The engine was still running, her hospital badge was tangled in her hair, and her phone kept vibrating with unread messages from Wesley. "Baby, come home. You're working too hard again. 1 more year and we'll finally have our dream house." Back then, those messages used to feel like love. Now, standing in that cold marble kitchen, years later, hearing that another woman legally owned the home she had nearly destroyed herself to build those memories, felt more like manipulation wrapped in romance. But 5 years earlier, Zella still believed in sacrifice. She believed love meant endurance, and she was very, very good at enduring. Her alarm went off at 5:15 every morning. She worked ICU night shifts 4 days a week in Manhattan. On Fridays and Saturdays, she did bookkeeping for a luxury dental practice in Westchester. Sundays were for catering weddings at upscale country clubs where women in silk gowns complained about champagne temperatures while Zella smiled through swollen feet and back pain. Sometimes she worked 36 hours without real sleep. Sometimes she cried in hospital bathrooms for exactly 2 minutes before wiping her face and going back to patients who needed her more than she needed herself. But every direct deposit made her feel closer to the future Wesley kept promising. "Our house is going to be beautiful," he'd whisper while rubbing her shoulders after midnight. And Zella believed him every single time. Wesley Harper had a voice that made impossible things sound safe. He worked in corporate finance for a real estate development company in Manhattan. Tall, polished, confident, he fit perfectly into the wealthy Connecticut family he came from. Old money, country clubs, summer homes, parents who treated emotional warmth like a tax bracket they refused to fall into, especially his mother, Diane Whitmore. Even thinking her name made Zella's chest tighten. Diane never openly insulted her. That would have been easier. Instead, she specialized in elegant cruelty. Tiny comments, soft smiles, poison dressed like sophistication. "Oh, Zella works another overnight shift," Diane once said over brunch. "I suppose ambition looks different for working-class girls." Or, "You're such a hard little worker." Wesley has always had a soft spot for strays. Every insult came wrapped in a crystal wineglass and a smile polished enough to belong in a magazine. And Wesley, he always found a way to minimize it. "She's old-fashioned. She doesn't mean it like that. You know how Mom is." No, Zella thought bitterly now. I didn't know how she was. Not really. Because if she had known, she never would have handed that woman 5 years of her life. The house project started after their second wedding anniversary, a modern 6-bedroom property in Greenwich overlooking the water, floor-to-ceiling windows, heated marble floors, custom kitchen imported from Italy. Zella remembered the first time they toured the unfinished property. She had stood in the skeletal frame of the future living room wearing scrubs after a double shift while Wesley wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. "Can you imagine our kids here someday?" he whispered. She cried right there on the construction floor, not because of the house, because she thought she was finally building a family. After that, every decision became about the house. No vacations, no days off, no luxury purchases for herself. While her co-workers bought designer bags and booked beach trips, Zella packed peanut butter sandwiches and worked overtime. Every dollar mattered, and she contributed almost all of it. The down payment alone had drained years of her savings. Wesley handled the paperwork. That was always his thing. You already do enough, he'd tell her. I'll take care of the boring legal stuff. And because she loved him, she trusted him. Trust, she would later learn, was the most expensive thing she ever gave away. One November night, after a brutal ICU shift, where 2 patients died within hours of each other, Zella dragged herself home at nearly midnight. The new house was still under construction then, so they were renting a luxury apartment in Stamford. She quietly stepped inside, exhausted beyond language. The apartment lights were dim except for the kitchen. Wesley sat at the counter with his laptop open beside a stack of papers. He quickly closed one folder when he saw her. "You're home early," he said too fast. Zella barely noticed at the time. She kicked off her shoes and leaned against the counter. "My feet are bleeding." Wesley stood immediately and kissed her forehead. "Come sit down." He poured her wine, massaged her shoulders, told her how proud he was of her. That was the dangerous thing about Wesley. He could betray someone while making them feel adored. "You know," he said softly one day, "none of this struggle is going to matter." Zella smiled weakly. "It already matters." He brushed hair from her face. "No. One day you'll walk into that house and realize every sacrifice was worth it." God. That sentence haunted her now, because technically he had told the truth. She did walk into that house one day and realize exactly what all her sacrifices had been worth to him. Nothing. Weeks later, another crack appeared small enough to ignore at the time. Diane invited them to dinner at her mansion in Greenwich. Halfway through dessert, Diane casually asked, "So, Wesley, have the ownership structures been finalized yet?" Wesley froze for half a second, tiny, almost invisible, but Zella noticed it. "Almost," he answered quickly. Diane nodded while sipping wine. "Smart. These things should always stay protected." Protected from who? The question flashed briefly through Zella's mind before disappearing beneath exhaustion and trust. Because she still thought she was included in the word family. She still thought Wesley saw her as a partner, not an employee funding his future. That winter became brutal. Zella picked up additional hospital shifts because construction costs increased unexpectedly. One night she fainted inside a supply room from exhaustion. Another nurse found her on the floor. "You're going to kill yourself," her coworker Maria warned. Zella laughed weakly. "Not until this house is finished." But slowly, strange things started surfacing. Missed calls Wesley wouldn't explain. Private conversations with Diane. Folders closed too quickly. And then there was the envelope, the one hidden deep inside Wesley's office drawer. It happened on a freezing Tuesday night in February. Wesley had asked her to email him a tax document while he was out. Zella sat down at his desk searching through folders. Then she saw it. A thick white envelope stamped with the logo of a Connecticut title company. Something cold crawled slowly up her spine. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe betrayal always announces itself before it speaks. Her fingers hovered over the envelope. Then she noticed something else. Her name wasn't anywhere on it. Only Wesley Harper and Diane Whitmore. Zella stared at those names for a very long time. Then, with shaking hands, she slowly reached for the envelope. The Harper family mansion looked less like a home and more like a place designed to remind people how small they were. Everything about it felt intimidating. The 12-foot iron gates, the stone fountain in the circular driveway, the silent valet who opened car doors without making eye contact. Even the air inside smelled expensive. Zella Harper stood in front of the massive mirror near the entryway, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her black dress while trying to slow her breathing. "You okay?" Wesley asked casually as he adjusted his cufflinks. She forced a smile. "Yeah." It was a lie. Dinner at Diane Whitmore's house always felt like walking into a room where everyone had already heard a joke about you before you arrived, and somehow you were the punchline. Diane hosted these monthly family dinners like they were royal ceremonies. Crystal glasses, imported candles, waitstaff in pressed uniforms, conversations that sounded polite until you listened closely enough to hear the cruelty underneath. Tonight's dinner was especially extravagant. Because Diane wanted to celebrate the nearing completion of the family property, that phrase alone made something uneasy twist in Zella's stomach. As they walked into the dining room, Diane stood at the head of the table wearing cream silk and diamonds that probably cost more than Zella's entire nursing salary. "There they are," Diane announced with a polished smile. "Our hard-working newlyweds." Newlyweds. They had been married almost 6 years. But Diane always used that word whenever she wanted to remind Zella she still considered the marriage temporary. Claire Harper looked up from her wineglass first. Claire Brandon's wife was the kind of woman who never missed Pilates, never repeated an outfit, and never hid her contempt for people she considered beneath her. "You look exhausted, Zella," Claire said sweetly. "Long shift?" "Double shift," Zella answered politely. Claire gave a dramatic little gasp. "Oh my God, I can't even imagine living like that." "You already don't," Zella thought. Instead, she smiled. "It's temporary." Diane exchanged a glance with Claire over the table. "That's what ambitious people always say before they burn themselves out." Wesley sat beside Zella and immediately reached for the wine. He never noticed the tension early enough, or maybe he noticed and simply preferred pretending he didn't. Brandon Harper arrived late, already smelling faintly like bourbon. "Sorry," he announced loudly. "Traffic was a nightmare." "No," Claire muttered under her breath. "You were golfing." Brandon grinned shamelessly and kissed the top of her head before collapsing into his chair. Unlike Wesley, Brandon never pretended to be refined. He was loud, reckless, arrogant, and occasionally cruel in ways that almost seemed accidental. Almost. Dinner began. For the first 20 minutes, Zella mostly stayed quiet while the family discussed investment portfolios, vacation homes in Aspen, and some political fundraiser Diane was hosting the following month. Then came the questions. They always came eventually. So Diane said lightly while cutting into her sea bass, "How many jobs are we up to now, Zella?" Wesley sighed quietly beside her. "Mum." "No, I'm genuinely asking," Diane interrupted smoothly. "I lose track." "3," Zella answered calmly. Diane lifted her brows. "3 jobs and still smiling. That's either admirable or deeply concerning." Claire laughed softly into her napkin. Brandon took another drink. "At least she's useful," he joked. "Most wives in this town just spend money." The table laughed. Even Wesley smiled a little. That hurt more than the joke itself. Zella felt heat rise into her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. For years, she had trained herself not to react, not to embarrass Wesley, not to create conflict, not to appear emotional. That was the unspoken rule around wealthy people like the Harpers. They could humiliate you publicly. But the moment you reacted, you became the problem. Diane sipped her wine elegantly. "You know," she said, "when Wesley first introduced you to us, I assumed this marriage would be difficult." Silence spread slowly across the table. Wesley looked uncomfortable now. "Mom." "No, let me finish," Diane continued pleasantly. "I simply worried that 2 people from very different worlds might eventually want very different things." Zella set down her fork carefully. And what exactly do you think I want? Diane smiled. Security. The word landed like an insult. Zella stared at her. I had security before Wesley. Claire raised an eyebrow as if surprised Zella had spoken back at all. Diane tilted her head. Yes, but not this kind. That kind. The mansion, the status, the money, the name. Suddenly, Zella understood something terrifying. Diane truly believed Zella married Wesley to climb upward, as if love could only exist between equals in wealth, as if sacrifice counted less when performed by someone from the middle class. Wesley finally stepped in. Can we not do this tonight? Diane smiled calmly. I'm simply protecting family interests. There it was again. Family. But every time Diane used that word, it sounded like Zella had accidentally wandered into a private club without membership. Dinner became harder after that. Every conversation felt loaded. Every glance carried hidden judgment. At one point, Claire began discussing interior designers for the new house. Oh, and the West Wing came out beautifully, she said. West Wing. Zella almost laughed. Who even talked like that? Diane nodded approvingly. The property is turning into a true Harper home. Not Wesley and Zella's home, a Harper home. Zella suddenly lost her appetite. She excused herself quietly and headed toward the kitchen for water. The farther she got from the dining room, the easier it became to breathe. She stood alone near the sink, gripping the marble counter. Maybe she was overthinking things. Maybe exhaustion was making her paranoid. Maybe voices interrupted her thoughts. Male voices, coming from the hallway near Diane's office. Brandon and Wesley. Zella didn't mean to listen, at first, but then she heard her own name. I'm serious, Brandon was saying between amused laughs. What happens if she leaves you one day? She won't. Wesley answered immediately. How do you know? A pause. Then Wesley laughed quietly. Because she's loyal to a fault. Something about the confidence in his voice made Zella's stomach tighten. Brandon lowered his voice. Still, if things ever go bad, she could take half. Another pause. Then relax, Wesley said casually. Legally, she can't touch anything. The world seemed to stop moving. Zella froze behind the hallway corner. Brandon let out a whistle. Damn, Mom really handled everything, huh? She insisted, Wesley replied. And honestly, she was right. Zella felt cold all over. Not emotional cold, physical cold, like her body had realized danger before her mind fully understood it. Brandon laughed again. That woman terrifies me. She terrifies everybody. And Zella has no idea, Wesley chuckled softly. Nope. The sound nearly destroyed her. Because it wasn't cruel. It was casual. That was the worst part. He didn't sound guilty. He sounded comfortable, like deception had become normal, like lying to his wife for years was simply another adult responsibility. Zella stepped backwards silently before either man could see her. Her pulse pounded violently in her ears. Legally, she can't touch anything. The sentence repeated over and over in her mind. What did that mean? Anything. 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 By the time she returned to the dining room, Diane looked up immediately, almost knowingly, as if she could sense the shift, as if predators always recognized the exact moment prey realized the trap had already closed. Everything all right, dear? Diane asked smoothly. Zella stared at her for a long moment, then at Wesley. He smiled at her normally, warmly, like he hadn't just shattered something fundamental inside her. And suddenly, for the first time in 6 years, Zella Harper looked at her husband and felt unsafe. Not physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually, unsafe. She sat down slowly at the table, Diane lifted her wine glass. To family, she said elegantly, everyone raised their glasses, except Zella, because deep down, something inside her had already started understanding the truth. She had spent years killing herself to build a future, but somehow, she had never actually been included in it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Zella Harper sat alone in Wesley's office while snow fell quietly outside the apartment windows, covering the city in soft white silence that felt painfully disconnected from the storm building inside her chest. Her fingers trembled as she opened the seal. Every instinct in her body already knew she was about to discover something terrible. But human beings have a strange relationship with betrayal. Even when the truth is standing directly in front of us, part of us still hopes we misunderstood, still hopes love will rescue us from reality. Zella slowly pulled out the documents: property transfer forms, closing records, ownership agreements. Legal terminology blurred together at first because her pulse was too loud in her ears. Then she saw it. Owner of record, Diane Whitmore. Zella stopped breathing. No Wesley Harper, no Zella Harper, only Diane. The room suddenly felt smaller, hotter. She flipped pages faster now: mortgage structures, trust protections, property tax records. Every single legal document tied the house to Diane Whitmore, not the marriage, not the couple, not the woman who had worked herself into exhaustion to finance it. Diane. Oh my God. The words slipped out before she realized she had spoken. Zella sat frozen at the desk, staring at the papers while memories attacked her one after another. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every dinner eaten from vending machines inside hospital hallways, every time Wesley kissed her forehead and promised, "This house belongs to us." A sound escaped her throat, not a sob, something lower, something wounded. She looked again, desperately searching for her name, buried somewhere deeper in the documents. Maybe secondary ownership, maybe beneficiary clauses, maybe nothing. There was nothing. She wasn't part of the ownership structure at all. Legally, she had funded a mansion owned by her mother-in-law, a mother-in-law who openly disliked her. The realization was so humiliating, Zella physically doubled over in the chair. She suddenly understood why Wesley never wanted her involved in paperwork, why Diane constantly used the phrase family investment, why Brandon laughed, why Wesley said she couldn't touch anything. Because they had already built the trap years ago, and she had financed it herself. The apartment door opened 40 minutes later. Wesley walked inside carrying takeout bags and smiling casually. "Hey, baby, I brought that Thai place you like?" Then he saw the documents spread across the desk. Everything inside him visibly froze. For one full second, neither of them moved. Then Wesley slowly set the food down. "Zella." Her eyes lifted toward him. He immediately recognized the expression on her face, not anger, worse, devastation, the kind that changes people permanently. "How long?" she asked quietly. Wesley rubbed a hand over his mouth. "It's not what you think." A bitter laugh escaped her. "That's what men say when it's exactly what I think." He walked closer carefully, like approaching a dangerous situation. "Let me explain." "No," she whispered. "You let me work myself into the ground for 5 years. You can answer one question first." Her voice cracked. "How long did you know?" Wesley hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. "From the beginning," she said numbly. He exhaled heavily. "Zella." "From the beginning." "Yes." The word shattered something inside her. Zella stood so suddenly the chair slammed backward against the wall. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this entire time. Lower your voice." The response stunned her. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "I didn't mean to hurt you." Lower your voice. as if her pain was inconveniencing him. Zella stared at the man she had loved for 6 years and suddenly realized she did not know him at all. "Tell me why," she demanded. Wesley ran frustrated hands through his hair. "My mother structured it this way for protection. Protection from who you're overreacting." The sentence hit like gasoline on fire. Overreacting. Zella laughed in disbelief. "I paid for that house, Wesley. No one's denying that. Then why isn't my name on it?" He looked away. That tiny movement destroyed the last fragile piece of hope she still carried. "Because Mom wanted safeguards." Zella blinked slowly. Safeguards. She's seen ugly divorces before. "So your mother protected family money by making sure your wife had no rights. It wasn't personal." Zella actually laughed. A sharp, broken sound. "Not personal," she repeated. "You let me work 3 jobs while your mother quietly claimed ownership of everything I was building. You're still my wife." The sentence echoed through the room. Zella stared at him in disbelief. "You think that makes this better?" Wesley's frustration finally surfaced. "I think you're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." Her face went completely still. That scared him more than yelling would have. "You lied to me for years. I omitted details." "Oh my God!" Zella, financially this made sense. "No," she snapped. "Financially this protected you." Wesley crossed his arms now, defensive. "You're acting like I cheated on you." The irony of the sentence would become horrifying later. But in this moment, Zella was too devastated to notice. "You betrayed me," she whispered. "That's dramatic." "No," she said softly. "What's dramatic is watching someone destroy themselves for a future you secretly stole from them." Silence crashed between them. Then the front door opened again. Diane Whitmore entered carrying shopping bags and stopped immediately when she sensed tension. Her eyes moved to the documents on the desk, then to Zella. And unlike Wesley, Diane did not even pretend guilt. She simply sighed. "Well," she said calmly, "I suppose this conversation was inevitable." Zella looked at her in disbelief. "You knew I didn't know." "Of course." Diane set down her purse slowly. "I assumed Wesley would eventually explain things properly." "You mean after I finished paying for everything?" Diane's expression hardened slightly. "No one forced you to contribute financially." Zella felt rage begin replacing shock. "Are you serious?" "You're an adult woman, Zella. Every contribution you made was voluntary." "Voluntary." The word nearly made her sick. 5 years of sacrifice reduced to voluntary contributions. Diane walked closer with cold elegance. "You need to understand something," she said. "Marriage is emotional. Assets are strategic." Zella stared at her. "And what exactly was your strategy?" "To protect my son. From his wife. From instability." Something inside Zella snapped. "I was working 80-hour weeks to build that house." "And yet emotionally," Diane replied coolly. "You've always been somewhat unpredictable." Wesley shifted uncomfortably. "Mom." "No, let her hear this." Diane folded her hands calmly. "Women like me learn early that love without legal protection is foolish. Women like me." There it was again. The constant reminder that Zella would never fully belong in their world. Diane looked around the office. "You're taking this far too emotionally." Zella's eyes filled with tears. "Because it mattered to me." Diane's expression softened slightly, but not with compassion, with pity. "That," Diane said quietly, "was your first mistake." The cruelty of the sentence stole the air from the room. Even Wesley looked uncomfortable now, but he still said nothing, still chose silence. And suddenly Zella understood the truth that had been sitting in front of her for years. Diane may have designed the betrayal, but Wesley allowed it, protected it, participated in it. That realization hurt more than the documents themselves, Because strangers can exploit you, enemies can deceive you, but only someone you love can make you feel foolish for trusting them. Zella slowly gathered the papers with shaking hands. You let me kill myself for this house. Wesley stepped closer. Baby, don't call me that. The sharpness in her voice stopped him cold. Tears slid silently down her cheeks now, but her expression had changed. Less broken, more awake. Diane noticed it first. And for the first time all evening, Diane Whitmore looked slightly nervous. Then Zella spoke, very quietly. You know the worst part, neither of them answered. I would have still built that house with you, she whispered to Wesley, if you had just loved me enough to tell me the truth. Wesley's face cracked slightly, but it was too late, because the woman standing in front of him now was no longer blindly loyal. She was beginning to see clearly, and clarity is the first stage of leaving. The fight started at 11:43 p.m. Zella remembered the exact time because she looked at the microwave clock while Wesley told her she was making everything toxic. 3 hours earlier, she had still been crying. Now she felt strangely numb. The kind of numbness that comes after emotional devastation exhausts itself and leaves only silence behind. Wesley paced across the living room in grey sweatpants and a cashmere sweater that Zella had bought him for Christmas last year. That house is still ours, he insisted. Zella sat motionless on the couch. No, she said quietly. It's your mother's. You're twisting this. I'm reading legal documents. Wesley dragged both hands through his hair aggressively. You're acting like I robbed you. Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. You did. That stopped him for half a second. Then anger hardened his face. I am so tired of this victim act. The sentence hit harder than yelling would have. Victim act. As if exhaustion, betrayal, and humiliation were performance choices. Zella stared at him carefully, almost like she was seeing a stranger emerge from behind the man she married. You watched me work myself sick. You wanted to work. No, she snapped. I wanted a future, and you have one. No, Wesley, you have one. The room fell silent. Outside, freezing rain slammed softly against the apartment windows while Manhattan glowed cold and distant beyond the glass. For years, Zella thought suffering together built intimacy. Now she realized suffering alone only builds resentment. Wesley exhaled sharply. You know what your problem is? Zella laughed weakly. Oh, this should be good. You always need emotional reassurance for everything. She blinked slowly. What? You constantly need validation, gratitude, proof. Nothing is ever enough. Zella physically recoiled because suddenly memories began rearranging themselves in her mind. Every time she cried from exhaustion and Wesley told her she was too emotional, every time she asked about finances and he said she was stressing herself out, every moment she doubted her own instincts because he always sounded calmer than she did. Gaslighting was terrifying because it rarely looked violent. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like logic. Sometimes it looked exactly like Wesley Harper. I gave you everything, she whispered. No, Wesley shot back. You contributed to a marriage like adults do. Contributed. Again with that word, like she was some temporary investor instead of a wife. Zella stood up slowly. I need air. Wesley laughed once in disbelief. Of course you do. That was the moment something irreversible happened inside her, not because of the insult itself, but because she realized Wesley genuinely believed she was the problem. He didn't think he betrayed her. He thought she failed to accept betrayal gracefully. That realization chilled her more than the rain outside. Zella grabbed her coat and keys. Wesley followed her toward the door. Don't be dramatic. She stopped, turned slowly, And for the first time in their marriage, Wesley looked uncertain around her. "Do you know what's dramatic?" she asked quietly. He crossed his arms. "What?" "Working 3 jobs while your husband and his mother build legal protections against you behind your back." His jaw tightened. "You keep framing this like some conspiracy." "Because it was. Jesus Christ, Zella." "No," she whispered. "Jesus Christ was honest." The silence after that sentence felt dangerous. Wesley looked away first. That told her everything. Then Diane entered the apartment. Again, like some elegant ghost that appeared whenever Wesley started losing control of the narrative. She removed leather gloves slowly and looked between them. "This is still happening." Zella almost laughed. "Still happening." As though devastation had an acceptable time limit, she found the documents, Wesley muttered. Diane sighed. "Well, clearly hiding them longer wouldn't have helped." Zella stared at her in disbelief. "You talk about my marriage like it's a business merger." "In many ways it is." "No," Zella said sharply. "It was supposed to be love." Diane's eyes softened slightly, but again not with empathy, with superiority. "Love without strategy ruins people." Zella stepped closer. "And strategy without love ruins souls." For the first time, Diane's expression flickered. Tiny, but real. Then it disappeared. "You're emotional right now," Diane said calmly. "You should stay somewhere else for a few days and clear your head." Zella looked at Wesley immediately, waiting, begging silently for him to say no, for him to choose her once. Just once. Wesley avoided her eyes. Maybe some space would help. That sentence broke her more completely than the paperwork had, because betrayal from enemies hurts. But abandonment from the person you protected hurts differently, more quietly, more permanently. "You want me to leave," she whispered. "We all need time to calm down." Wesley rubbed his forehead. "Please don't do this." A sharp laugh escaped her. "I already did this," she said. "I built your entire life." Diane stepped forward now, voice cool and controlled. "No one is throwing you away, Zella, but they already had. That was the unbearable part. They just wanted her to do it quietly, without ruining the atmosphere, without becoming inconvenient." Zella looked around the apartment slowly. The expensive furniture she helped pay for, the framed wedding photos, the life she thought was real. Suddenly, it all felt staged, like she had accidentally wandered into someone else's carefully managed illusion. Without another word, she grabbed an overnight bag and walked toward the door. Wesley followed. "Where are you going? I don't know. It's freezing outside." The irony almost made her scream. Now he noticed discomfort, not while she worked herself to exhaustion, not while she cried alone in hospital bathrooms, only now. As she opened the apartment door, Wesley grabbed her wrist gently. "Zella." She looked down at his hand, then at him. For a second, he almost looked like the man she fell in love with. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. People like Wesley were never monsters all the time, just enough of the time to destroy you slowly. "You're my wife," he whispered. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Then why did you protect everyone except me?" He had no answer. So she walked away. The rain outside felt like ice against her skin. By the time she reached the parking garage beneath the building, her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her keys twice. She sat inside her car, staring blankly through the windshield while tears rolled silently down her face. Not dramatic sobbing, just exhaustion finally leaking out of her body. The city lights blurred around her. Somewhere above, inside the luxury apartment she helped finance Wesley, and Diane were probably discussing damage control over expensive wine, and Zella, the woman who built everything, was sleeping in her car. Hours passed. At nearly 2 in the morning, her phone buzzed. A text from Wesley. "You're overreacting. Come home. No apology, no accountability, just irritation." Zella wiped her face angrily and tossed the phone aside. Then another notification appeared. Not a text. An incoming message preview from a contact she didn't recognize. Vanessa Cole. The message appeared briefly across Wesley's synced tablet, notifications, the same tablet still connected to their shared cloud account. "Can't wait until this divorce mess is finally over. I'm tired of hiding." Zella stopped breathing. Another message appeared. "You promised me we'd spend Christmas in the new house together." The world tilted violently. Her hands shook as she opened the synced account fully. Photos loaded first. Wesley and a blonde woman at a rooftop bar. Wesley touching her waist. Wesley smiling in ways he hadn't smiled at Zella in months. Then messages, flirting, hotel reservations, private jokes, dates stretching back nearly a year. One particular message shattered her completely. "Once Mum finalizes everything, Zella won't be able to touch the property anyway." Zella physically folded forward in the driver's seat as nausea crashed through her. Not just betrayal. Calculation, planning, replacement. The house, the legal protections, the affair. It was all connected, every single piece. And suddenly, through all the heartbreak and humiliation, one terrifyingly clear thought entered her mind. They never planned for her to survive this. The realization dried her tears instantly, because grief was beginning to transform into something else, something colder, something dangerous. At 2:17 a.m., Zella Harper picked up her phone and searched one name, Grace Holloway. Top divorce attorney, Manhattan. Then she pressed call. Grace Holloway's office sat on the 38th floor of a glass tower overlooking Manhattan. Cold, minimalist, expensive enough to intimidate people before they even sat down. Zella Harper almost canceled 3 times before stepping out of the elevator, not because she doubted what Wesley had done, but because part of her still couldn't believe this was her life now. Divorce attorneys belonged to other women, women in tabloids, women with dramatic marriages and screaming fights. Not women like Zella. Women like her stayed loyal, stayed patient, stayed exhausted. The receptionist looked up with practiced professionalism. Ms. Harper. Zella nodded quietly. "She's expecting you." Of course she was, because apparently even emotional collapse could be scheduled professionally in Manhattan. The office doors opened into a sleek corner room lined with dark shelves and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Grace Holloway stood near the window reading something on a tablet. Tall, sharp-featured, elegant in the kind of effortless way only very powerful women seemed to manage. She looked up once, then immediately noticed everything. The swollen eyes, the exhaustion, the emotional shock still clinging to Zella's body. Grace set the tablet down slowly. "You slept in your car last night." It wasn't a question. Zella blinked. "How did you—" "I've been doing this 20 years, Grace said calmly. "Women who've been emotionally blindsided all smell like cold air, coffee, and adrenaline." For the first time in 2 days, Zella almost smiled. Almost. Grace motioned toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit." Zella sat carefully, clutching her bag like armor. Grace didn't immediately start asking legal questions. She simply watched her quietly for a moment, and somehow that made Zella more emotional than sympathy would have. Most people interrupted pain quickly. Grace let it exist. Finally, Grace spoke. "Tell me everything." And Zella did. At first, the words came out disorganized. The house, the deed, Diane, the affair, the messages, the years of work. The betrayal layered so deeply into her marriage she no longer knew which memories were real. Grace listened without interrupting once. No pity, no dramatic reactions, only focus. When Zella finally finished, silence settled heavily across the office. Then Grace asked, "Do you have records?" Zella frowned weakly. Records, financial contributions, bank transfers, mortgage discussions, contractor payments, texts, emails. Zella blinked. Probably. Grace leaned back slightly. How organized are you? A humorless laugh escaped Zella. I worked 3 jobs for years. Organization was survival. Good. Grace opened a legal pad. Then your husband may have made a very expensive mistake. That sentence cut through the fog in Zella's brain. What do you mean? Grace folded her hands calmly. I mean, wealthy families often assume control equals protection, but people who believe they're untouchable tend to leave evidence everywhere. Something shifted inside Zella. Tiny, but important. For the first time since discovering the truth, someone wasn't talking to her like she was powerless. Grace stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. You said your husband handled all legal structures. Yes. And his mother orchestrated ownership. Yes. Grace nodded once, slowly. Classic. Zella stared at her. Classic. Grace turned back around. Women like Diane Whitmore believe marriage is risk management. She likely structured ownership to shield family assets while using your income to build equity. Zella swallowed hard. So, I really have nothing. Grace's expression sharpened immediately. I didn't say that. The confidence in her voice startled Zella. Grace sat back down. Listen carefully to me because this matters. She leaned forward slightly. Ownership and contribution are not always the same thing legally. Zella felt her pulse quicken. You think I have a case? I think wealthy people become arrogant when they believe working-class women won't fight back. The sentence hit something deep inside her. Working-class women, not said with judgment, said with respect. Zella looked down, suddenly embarrassed by the tears filling her eyes again. I feel stupid. Grace's voice softened slightly. Why? Because I trusted him. No, Grace corrected calmly. You loved him. That nearly broke her, because Wesley had spent days making her feel irrational, emotional, difficult. But Grace made betrayal sound exactly like what it was. A violation, not an overreaction. Zella looked up slowly. He keeps acting like I'm dramatic for being hurt. Grace actually smiled at that, coldly. That's because minimizing your emotions helped maintain control. The word control settled heavily into the room. Not marriage problems, not miscommunication. Control. Grace continued. Tell me something. Whenever you questioned finances, paperwork, or decisions, did Wesley make you feel emotional for asking? Zella thought about it, then slowly nodded. All the time. Did he praise your sacrifice while simultaneously excluding you from actual financial authority? Another nod. Grace wrote something down. And his mother regularly implied you were lucky to marry into their world. Zella stared at her. How do you already know these people? Grace gave a small, humorless smile. Because rich men raised by controlling women tend to become predictable. That sentence stayed with Zella. Predictable, meaning this wasn't unique, meaning other women had survived this too. Grace extended her hand. Give me your phone. Zella handed it over. Grace began reviewing screenshots from Wesley's messages with Vanessa. The affair, the property discussions, the comments about protecting assets before divorce. Grace's expression darkened slightly. Oh, this is worse than I thought. Fear immediately tightened in Zella's chest. What? Grace rotated the phone toward her. This message. Once Mum finalizes everything, Zella won't be able to touch the property anyway. Grace tapped the screen lightly. That suggests awareness. Awareness of what potential concealment strategy. Zella's stomach twisted. You think they planned this? Grace looked directly at her. I think your husband and his mother intentionally structured ownership while benefiting from your labor and financial contribution. The words landed like thunder. Not emotional betrayal, intentional strategy. Suddenly, every memory felt contaminated. Every kiss, every promise, every, I'm proud of you. Zella covered her mouth as nausea rose again. Grace's tone softened for the first time. Hey, Zella looked up. What happened to you was wrong. Simple sentence. 6 words. But Zella nearly cried harder hearing them than she had during the entire confrontation with Wesley, because validation after prolonged manipulation feels like oxygen returning to drowning lungs. Grace slid a tissue box toward her. Now, she said calmly, shifting back into professional focus, I need you to stop thinking like a wife. Zella wiped her eyes slowly, and start thinking like what Grace's gaze sharpened. A woman they underestimated. Silence filled the office. Not hopeless silence this time, something else, something changing. Grace began listing instructions. Starting today, you gather everything. Everything. Bank statements, pay stubs, wire transfers, tax returns, construction invoices, text messages, calendar logs, proof of overtime hours, anything connected to that property. Zella nodded slowly. I saved most things. Good. Don't confront them anymore emotionally. That surprised her. Grace continued. No more screaming matches. No more begging for honesty. People like Wesley perform confusion when cornered. Stop giving him emotional access to your thinking. Zella sat very still, because suddenly she realized something terrifying. Grace understood Wesley better after 30 minutes than Zella had after 6 years. Do you think he ever loved me? She whispered before she could stop herself. Grace paused, then answered honestly. Yes. Zella's chest tightened painfully. But not enough to stop benefiting from your sacrifice. The truth of that sentence nearly crushed her. Grace closed the folder. One more thing. What Grace's eyes locked onto hers. Predators count on shame to keep good women quiet. Zella swallowed hard. You think Wesley's a predator? I think Grace said, carefully. Good men confess mistakes. A pause. Then predators hide assets. The room went silent. And for the first time since her marriage collapsed, Zella Harper felt something stronger than grief beginning to rise inside her. Not revenge. Not yet. Something colder. Clarity. Zella Harper stopped crying on a Thursday morning at 4:12 a.m., not because the pain disappeared, not because Wesley suddenly apologized, not because the betrayal hurt less. She stopped crying because she found the spreadsheet, and spreadsheets don't care about emotions. They care about patterns, numbers, dates, proof. Zella sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor of the small extended-stay hotel room Grace Holloway had insisted she move into temporarily instead of sleeping in her car again. Takeout containers surrounded her. Bank statements covered the bed. Her laptop glowed in the darkness while rain tapped softly against the window. For 3 straight days, she barely slept. Not from heartbreak anymore, from realization. The deeper she dug, the uglier everything became. At first, she only wanted to understand how much money she had contributed toward the house. But then the patterns started emerging. Wire transfers, construction payments, vendor deposits. Almost every major payment connected back to her income, her overtime, her savings, her labor, yet every legal structure removed her name entirely. It wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Zella highlighted another transaction and leaned back slowly. Oh my God. The numbers alone were horrifying. Over 5 years, she had contributed nearly $740,000 directly or indirectly toward the property. $740,000. The realization physically stole her breath. That was more money than Wesley himself had personally contributed in liquid cash, and somehow she legally owned nothing. Her phone buzzed. Wesley. Again. She stared at the screen while it rang, then stopped, then immediately rang again. Finally, she answered. What? Silence for half a second. Then Wesley's voice softened. Baby, don't call me that. He exhaled heavily. Can we please stop doing this? Zella actually laughed. Doing this? As if mutual conflict had caused this situation instead of calculated betrayal. You cheated on me, she said flatly. Wesley went quiet. Then, you went through my private messages. The audacity stunned her so deeply she almost admired it. You had a year-long affair. It wasn't serious. The sentence landed like acid. Not serious. As though deception became acceptable if emotionally downgraded enough. Zella closed her eyes briefly. You let another woman discuss moving into the house I paid for. It never got that far. You told her I wouldn't touch the property. That was just conversation. No, Zella whispered. That was planning. His voice hardened immediately. You're twisting everything. There it was again. The rewriting of reality, the subtle attempt to make her question her own conclusions. But something had changed now, because Grace had named the pattern, and once manipulation receives language, it becomes harder to fall for. I'm done arguing emotionally with you, Zella said calmly. That pause on the other end told her he noticed the difference too. What does that mean? It means from now on you can talk to my attorney. Wesley's tone sharpened instantly. You hired a lawyer and... Jesus Christ, Zella. No, she said quietly. Jesus Christ again would probably still be more honest than you. He cursed under his breath. You're blowing up our marriage over paperwork. No, Wesley. You blew it up over greed. She hung up before he could answer. Then she stared at her reflection in the dark hotel window. She looked terrible. Dark circles, pale skin, hair pulled into a messy knot, but beneath the exhaustion, something new existed now. Focus. Grace arrived an hour later carrying coffee and legal folders. You look homicidal, Grace observed calmly. I found the numbers. Grace sat beside her at the table. How bad? Zella rotated the laptop. Grace studied the spreadsheets silently, then slowly leaned back. Well, she said carefully, that's financially catastrophic for them. A tiny spark of satisfaction flickered inside Zella for the first time. Grace continued scrolling. Wait! Her expression sharpened. What? Grace pointed toward a contractor payment sequence. These invoices are strange? Zella frowned. What do you mean, duplicate structuring? Look. Grace highlighted multiple construction payments divided into smaller amounts across separate accounts. At first glance, it looked normal. Then Zella noticed the pattern too. Her payments had been intentionally fragmented, hidden, minimized. Why would they do that? Grace looked up slowly. To obscure contribution percentages. Silence. Cold silence. Because that meant someone had actively worked to erase her financial footprint. Grace stood immediately. I need names of who contractors, builders, project managers. everyone involved. For the next 2 days, Zella helped Grace compile records connected to the property construction. Most people avoided involvement once lawyers entered the conversation, except one man, Eddie Morales, general contractor, mid-50s, straightforward, tired eyes. He agreed to meet them at a diner in White Plains. Rain hammered the windows while Eddie stirred black coffee nervously. "I don't want problems," he muttered immediately. Grace leaned forward calmly. "Then tell the truth." Eddie glanced at Zella. Recognition flickered across his face. "You're the nurse lady." Zella blinked. "What? You used to come by the property after hospital shifts." He shook his head slowly. "Hell, sometimes you looked half dead." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in her throat. Someone noticed. Someone actually noticed. Eddie sighed heavily. "You paid for more of that house than anybody." Grace and Zella exchanged a look. "Can you prove that?" Grace asked. Eddie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Wesley had me split invoices." Zella froze. "What?" Eddie rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. "He said certain payments needed different accounting classifications." Grace's voice became dangerously calm. "Did he specifically mention hiding Mrs. Harper's contributions?" Eddie looked miserable now. "Not directly, but he said—" Eddie swallowed hard. "He said his mother didn't want the wife too financially attached to the property." The wife, not even Zella, just the wife, like she was interchangeable. Zella suddenly felt physically ill. Grace remained composed. "Did Diane Whitmore communicate with you directly?" Eddie nodded once. "Couple times." "About what?" "She wanted detailed separation between family capital and marital contribution records." Grace sat back slowly. There it was. Intentionality, not confusion, not misunderstanding, strategy. Eddie looked at Zella carefully. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "everybody on site thought the house belonged to you." The sentence nearly shattered her, because in her heart, it had. On the drive back to Manhattan, neither woman spoke much. Finally, Zella stared out the window and whispered, "How do people do this to someone they claim to love?" Grace kept her eyes on traffic. "Power distorts morality." "That's not an answer." "No," Grace agreed quietly. "It's an explanation." Back at the hotel, Zella continued searching through old backups and synced devices. By midnight, her eyes burned from exhaustion. Then suddenly, a voicemail notification. Unknown file. Saved automatically years earlier. Zella clicked it absently. Diane's voice filled the room instantly. Cold. Controlled. Precise. "Make sure Zella never receives the closing documents directly. If she asks questions, simplify things emotionally. The less involved she feels legally, the easier this process stays." Silence. Then Wesley's voice. "I know." Zella stopped breathing. Grace slowly lowered the legal papers in her hands. Neither woman spoke for several seconds, because this changed everything. Not manipulation implied, manipulation documented. Intentional concealment, emotional control, proof. Finally, Grace stood very slowly and smiled for the first time since meeting her, not kindly, dangerously. "Well," she said softly, "this just became fraud." Zella stared at the frozen audio file on the screen, the voices of the two people she trusted most sitting casually inside a conspiracy against her life, and suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, she no longer felt heartbroken. She felt angry. The ballroom glowed like old money pretending to be charity. Crystal chandeliers reflected against towers of champagne glasses, while a string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. Women in couture gowns drifted through the room, smelling like expensive perfume and curated lives. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed investments, politics, and private schools with the detached confidence of people who had never feared losing everything. Diane Whitmore loved events like this because rooms like these ran on image, and Diane had spent her entire life mastering the art of appearances. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was one of the biggest social events in Greenwich. Politicians attended, CEOs attended, real estate investors treated invitations like status symbols. And tonight, Diane intended to use the event for one specific purpose: to quietly reintroduce Wesley Harper to society as a man already moving on from his unstable wife. Zella knew that before she even arrived. Grace had warned her. "They'll try to isolate you socially before court begins," Grace explained earlier that afternoon while helping Zella review legal filings. "People like Diane understand reputation is leverage." Zella stared at herself in the mirror of the hotel room while Grace adjusted the sleeve of her black satin gown. "I don't belong in rooms like this anymore." Grace met her eyes through the reflection. "No," she corrected calmly. "They just convinced you that you didn't." That sentence stayed with Zella the entire drive to the gala. By the time she arrived at the Whitmore estate, cold rain shimmered across the massive stone driveway. Valets hurried between luxury cars while photographers snapped social photos beneath glowing white tents. Zella stepped out of the car slowly, and for the first time in weeks, people stared, not because she looked broken, because she didn't. The black gown fit her perfectly. Her dark hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder. Her makeup was minimal, but sharp enough to hide the exhaustion that had consumed her for months. Grace stepped beside her in an ivory pantsuit that radiated dangerous competence. "You ready?" Grace asked quietly. Zella looked toward the mansion doors. Inside that house waited the husband who betrayed her, the mother-in-law who orchestrated it, and the woman Wesley had already started replacing her with. "No," Zella admitted honestly. Grace nodded once. "Good. Fear keeps people alert." Then together they walked inside. The ballroom conversations shifted almost immediately. Zella felt it happen physically, heads turning, whispers spreading, judgment moving invisibly through the crowd. "Poor thing. That's Wesley's wife. I heard she had some kind of breakdown. Didn't he already move out?" The humiliation should have crushed her. Instead, it made her colder. At the center of the room, Diane Whitmore stood surrounded by donors wearing a silver gown that looked deliberately regal. Beside her stood Wesley, and next to Wesley, Vanessa Cole, beautiful, polished, tall blonde hair cascading over one bare shoulder, and wearing the exact designer gown Zella once pointed out months ago while window shopping in Soho. Wesley bought it for her anyway, just not for his wife. For one dangerous second, pain sliced sharply through Zella's chest. Not because Vanessa was prettier, not because Wesley cheated, but because betrayal always contains humiliation, and Wesley had humiliated her carefully, strategically, publicly. Vanessa noticed Zella first. The color drained from her face immediately. Wesley turned next, then froze. Completely. Because the woman standing at the ballroom entrance no longer looked heartbroken. She looked composed, and men like Wesley feared calm women far more than emotional ones. "Zella," he breathed. Diane turned slowly. For the first time since this war began, genuine shock flickered across her face. Not because Zella arrived, because she arrived looking untouchable. Grace leaned slightly toward Zella. "Remember," she whispered, "don't react emotionally unless you choose to." Zella nodded once, then walked forward. Every step felt surreal, like she was walking directly into the center of the life that once excluded her. People parted automatically around them. The quartet continued playing. Champagne glasses clinked softly somewhere behind the tension. Diane recovered first naturally. She smiled elegantly. "Zella," she said warmly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I didn't realize you'd be attending." Translation: "You weren't invited." Zella smiled back politely. "Funny. I helped pay for half this event." Several nearby guests shifted awkwardly. Wesley stepped closer immediately. "Can we talk privately?" "No." The simplicity of the answer visibly unsettled him. Vanessa looked deeply uncomfortable now. Good Zella thought coldly. For months, I was the only person forced to feel uncomfortable. Diane lifted her champagne glass calmly. "I think tonight should remain focused on charity." Grace finally stepped forward. "Oh, we agree completely," she said smoothly. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are Grace Holloway." Recognition flashed instantly across Diane's face, and for the first time all evening, Diane Whitmore lost composure. Tiny, but visible, because people in their social circle knew Grace's name. Divorce attorney, corporate litigator, financial predator in designer heels. Wesley looked between them, now panic beginning to surface beneath his polished exterior. "Zella," he warned quietly. She ignored him. Instead, she looked directly at Vanessa. "You should know," Zella said calmly. "He promised me forever while sleeping with you." The silence around them deepened instantly. Vanessa's face paled. Wesley lowered his voice sharply. "This is not the place." "No," Zella replied. "The place was my marriage. You destroyed it there first." Diane stepped forward, voice suddenly colder. "You're embarrassing yourself." That sentence almost made Zella laugh, because for years fear of embarrassment kept her obedient, quiet, tolerant. But humiliation loses power once someone survives betrayal. "No," Zella said softly. "I think your son handled that part already." Several guests openly pretended not to listen now, which in wealthy social circles meant everyone was listening. Grace opened her leather portfolio slowly. Diane noticed immediately, and something dangerous flickered across her eyes. "What exactly is this?" Diane asked carefully. Grace removed a thick envelope. "Formal notice." Wesley went pale. "Jesus Christ." Grace handed the documents directly to Diane. The movement looked elegant, almost casual, but Zella knew exactly what was happening. The lawsuit, financial claims, fraud allegations, forensic accounting requests, everything, publicly delivered, in the center of Diane Whitmore's perfect ballroom. Diane stared down at the envelope without touching it for several seconds, then finally took it. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What have you done?" Wesley whispered. Zella looked at him calmly. "What you should have expected when you mistook kindness for weakness." That sentence hit him visibly. Vanessa stepped backward slowly, beginning to understand the scale of what she had walked into. Grace's voice remained smooth and professional. "You've both been formally notified regarding claims involving financial concealment, marital asset manipulation, intentional misrepresentation, and unlawful contribution shielding." Nearby, conversations had completely stopped now. Nobody even pretended otherwise anymore. Diane finally opened the envelope. As she scanned the documents, something extraordinary happened. Her hand trembled, just slightly, but enough. Enough for Zella to see it. Enough for everyone nearby to see it. The mighty Diane Whitmore, queen of composure, architect of humiliation, was shaken. Wesley grabbed the papers from her abruptly. "This is insane," he snapped. Grace tilted her head calmly. "No," she corrected. "What's insane is convincing a woman to finance her own exploitation." The silence afterward felt electric. Diane looked at Zella with genuine hatred now, not superiority, not pity, hatred, because for the first time, the woman she underestimated was no longer begging to belong. She was fighting back. And worse, she had proof. A champagne glass slipped from Diane's fingers suddenly and shattered across the marble floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. Everyone stared. Diane Whitmore stood frozen among broken crystal and spilled champagne while legal papers trembled in her hands. And for the first time in years, Zella Harper finally saw fear in her eyes. The Harper family empire didn't collapse all at once. It cracked quietly first, like ice spreading beneath expensive shoes. 3 days after the gala, Wesley Harper walked into his Manhattan office and realized people had stopped smiling at him. Not openly, not dramatically, worse, professionally. The receptionist avoided eye contact. Co-workers lowered their voices when he passed, and his boss, Richard Ellison, sent him a calendar invite titled Urgent Internal Review. Wesley sat alone in the conference room 20 minutes later, gripping black coffee that had already gone cold. His phone buzzed non-stop beside him. Texts from Diane, calls from reporters, emails from attorneys, and worst of all, silence from people who normally rushed to protect powerful men. That silence terrified him. Richard entered first carrying a folder. 2 HR representatives followed. Wesley immediately stood. "What's going on?" Richard remained calm. "Sit down." That tone made Wesley's stomach tighten. Once seated, Richard slid several printed documents across the table. Bank transfers, expense reports, construction-related reimbursements. Wesley frowned. "What is this?" Richard folded his hands carefully. "These are financial discrepancies tied to personal property expenditures." Wesley's pulse spiked. "It's being handled privately." Richard's expression hardened. "It stopped being private once legal discovery requests hit our compliance department." The room suddenly felt smaller. One HR representative spoke next. "We've received allegations involving misuse of bonus allocations connected to marital asset concealment." Wesley stared at her blankly, then laughed once in disbelief. "You can't be serious." Richard didn't laugh. "We are very serious." Panic crawled slowly into Wesley's chest now. "This is because of my wife." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "This is because of your decisions." Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Zella Harper sat inside Grace Holloway's office reviewing updated filings while rain streaked the city windows. She looked calmer now, still exhausted, still grieving, but calmer. Like someone learning how to survive inside emotional ruins. Grace walked in carrying another stack of documents. "You were right." Zella looked up. "About what?" "They're panicking." A tiny flicker moved through Zella's chest. Not joy, validation. Grace placed the papers down. "Wesley's company has initiated internal review procedures." Zella swallowed slowly. "Will he lose his job?" Grace leaned back against the desk. "If the forensic accounting gets ugly enough?" "Possibly." The reality of that landed strangely inside Zella. Months ago, the thought would have devastated her. Now, it mostly made her tired. Because once love dies, consequences stop feeling personal, Grace continued. And Diane's social circle is already leaking. Zella frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means wealthy women gossip like investment bankers with wine glasses." That almost made Zella smile. Almost. Grace handed her another folder. "Also, your contractor witness is holding up well." Eddie Morales had already signed preliminary statements confirming invoice manipulation requests. Intentional concealment, structured separation, financial deception. Every new piece of evidence tightened the walls around Wesley and Diane. Still, none of it erased the emotional damage. That part surprised Zella the most. Justice didn't immediately heal betrayal. It simply gave pain direction. Her phone buzzed again. "Wesley," Grace noticed. "You going to answer?" Zella stared at the screen, then slowly nodded. "Speakerphone," Grace said immediately. Zella accepted the call. "What?" Wesley sounded exhausted, angrier than sad. "How far are you planning to take this?" The wording irritated her instantly, like she was escalating instead of responding. "How far did you take the lying?" A long silence followed. Then Wesley exhaled harshly. "You've destroyed my reputation." Zella blinked slowly. "I destroyed it. You publicly humiliated me." The audacity almost impressed her now. "You cheated on me. That has nothing to do with my career." Grace visibly rolled her eyes across the room. Zella's voice became colder. "No, Wesley. Your integrity has everything to do with your career. You're punishing me." "No," she said softly. "I'm finally protecting myself." Silence again. Then Wesley lowered his voice. "Mom says Grace Holloway is manipulating you." Grace mouthed unbelievable silently. Zella laughed once. "Your mother manipulated me for 6 years. That's not fair." "No," Zella whispered. "What wasn't fair was financing my own replacement." The line went quiet. Then finally, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." That sentence caught her off guard, not because it sounded apologetic, because it sounded revealing. Zella's eyes narrowed slightly. What exactly was supposed to happen? Wesley hesitated too long, and that hesitation answered everything. Grace noticed immediately too. Zella's chest tightened painfully. "You were going to leave me." "No. You already had the house protected. You already had Vanessa. You already had legal structures hiding assets." "Zella, you planned this." His silence became confession. Tears filled her eyes instantly, despite how hard she fought them. Not because she still hoped, because hearing the truth out loud still hurt. Wesley sounded panicked now. "It got complicated." "No," she whispered. "You got cruel." Then she hung up. The room stayed silent afterward. Grace watched her carefully. "You okay?" Zella stared at the dark phone screen. "No." And for the first time since this began, she allowed herself to admit it honestly, because empowerment didn't erase grief. It simply stopped grief from controlling her decisions. Across town, Diane Whitmore sat inside her estate library making furious phone calls. Every major social figure in Greenwich suddenly seemed busy. 3 charity board members quietly resigned. An investor postponed a fundraiser luncheon. Even Claire Harper stopped returning calls consistently. That scared Diane more than the lawsuit itself, because people like Diane survived through perception, and perception was shifting. Brandon entered the library carrying whiskey. "You should have settled quietly." Diane looked up sharply. "Excuse me." "She has proof." Diane's jaw tightened. "She has emotions." "No," Brandon corrected carefully. "Now she has evidence." Diane hated the fear creeping through her own house. She hated even more that Zella, the exhausted nurse she once dismissed as harmless, had become the center of it. "She's vindictive," Diane snapped. Brandon laughed bitterly. "You stole her life savings. I protected family assets. You used her." The sentence echoed through the room. Diane looked genuinely offended. She benefited from this family enormously. Brandon stared at his mother for a long moment, then quietly asked, "Did she?" The question lingered after he left. Meanwhile, Zella sat alone later that night reviewing more financial documents when another call appeared. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. then answered, "Hello, silence." Then a woman's voice, soft, careful. "This is Vanessa." Zella went still immediately. The room suddenly felt electric. Grace looked up sharply from across the office. Vanessa continued carefully, "I think you deserve to know the full truth." Zella's heartbeat slowed into something cold and dangerous, because instinct told her immediately whatever came next was going to make everything worse. Vanessa Cole chose a hotel bar in Tribeca for the meeting. Neutral territory, dim lighting, quiet enough for secrets. Zella Harper almost didn't go. Every instinct inside her rejected the idea of sitting face to face with the woman Wesley slept with while still crawling into bed beside her every night. But Grace Holloway insisted. "Mistresses usually know more than wives," Grace said bluntly. "Especially arrogant men's mistresses." So now Zella sat inside a dark velvet booth, gripping untouched sparkling water while rain blurred the city outside. At exactly 7:13, Vanessa walked in. She looked different tonight, less polished, less confident, like reality had finally reached her too. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa sat carefully across from her. "You're prettier than he described." Zella blinked slowly. "That's a strange way to start this conversation." Vanessa gave a weak laugh. "Honestly, nothing about this situation feels normal anymore." The waitress approached briefly. Vanessa ordered whiskey immediately. That told Zella a lot. Women who drink whiskey before difficult conversations are usually carrying guilt. Vanessa looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath her eyes, mascara slightly smudged. No expensive confidence tonight, just discomfort. Finally, Vanessa exhaled slowly. "I didn't know everything." Zella's jaw tightened. "You knew he was married?" "Yes." "Then congratulations. You knew enough." The words came out colder than she intended, but Vanessa nodded like she deserved it. "I did." Silence settled heavily between them. Then Vanessa reached into her designer bag and placed a thick folder on the table. Zella stared at it warily. "What's that things you need to see?" Zella didn't touch it yet. Vanessa looked down at her drink. "When I met Wesley, he told me your marriage was already over." "Of course he did. Men like Wesley never entered affairs honestly. They rewrote history first." Vanessa continued carefully. "He said you were emotionally unstable, that you refused to let go, that the relationship had been dead for years." Zella actually laughed softly. "Emotionally unstable. Because exhausted women are always labeled unstable once they stop tolerating disrespect quietly." He also said, Vanessa added bitterly, that you didn't contribute financially and that his mother protected family assets because you were irresponsible. That one hurt more than Zella expected. Not because she needed validation anymore, but because Wesley had erased her entire existence to make betrayal easier. "I worked 3 jobs, she whispered. Vanessa's eyes filled briefly with shame. "I know that now." The waitress brought the whiskey. Vanessa took a large sip immediately, then slid the folder across the table. "Open it." Zella hesitated before finally pulling the documents out. Emails, property discussions, investment projections, trust restructuring drafts. Then her stomach dropped. One email from Wesley to Vanessa read, "Once the property value increases another 20%, everything should transition smoothly after the divorce." Zella stopped breathing. Another message Mom thinks waiting until after the holidays makes the optics cleaner. Optics. Her marriage reduced to timing strategy. Vanessa watched her carefully. "I didn't understand what I was reading back then." Zella flipped pages faster now. There were diagrams of trust structures, projected resale values, financial movement discussions involving Diane, And then one sentence shattered her completely. Zella's contributions were useful, but emotionally, she's too attached to the property to think rationally. Useful. Useful. The same way someone describes labor. Not love. Not partnership. Utility. Zella slowly lowered the papers. Her hands were trembling again. Not from heartbreak this time, from rage. Vanessa looked genuinely miserable now. I didn't know they planned all this. They, Wesley, and Diane. Hearing them described as a team made something inside Zella finally click fully into place. For years, she thought her marriage had two people in it, but Diane had always been there too, shaping, controlling, directing. Vanessa swallowed hard. The house was always part of the plan. Zella stared at her. What plan? Vanessa looked away briefly. To protect Harper family wealth while Wesley transitioned out of the marriage. The sentence landed with surgical precision. Not emotional chaos, not impulsive betrayal, transition. Calculated, managed, corporate, like restructuring a business deal. Zella suddenly felt sick. He was going to leave me after the house appreciated in value. Vanessa nodded slowly. That's what I eventually realized, and you stayed anyway. Pain flickered across Vanessa's face. You think I'm proud of this? No, Zella answered honestly. I think you believed you were special. That silence afterward was brutal because it was true. Vanessa stared into her whiskey. He made me feel chosen. Zella almost pitied her. Almost. Because she remembered what Wesley was like when he wanted someone emotionally dependent on him. Attentive, protective, calm. He studied vulnerabilities like investment opportunities. He told me Diane hated you because you embarrassed the family. Zella laughed softly in disbelief. I embarrassed them by paying for their house. He told me you were obsessive, that you tracked finances and accused him of things constantly. The manipulation suddenly became obvious from every angle. Wesley hadn't just betrayed women, he tailored realities for them. To Zella, he minimized and gaslit. To Vanessa, he victimized himself. Two women, two different lies. Same manipulator. Vanessa rubbed her forehead tiredly. The night of the gala, that's when everything changed for me. Zella looked up. You looked terrified. I was. Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. I thought I was walking into a messy divorce situation. Then I realized I walked into something much uglier. Zella remained silent. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Your husband and his mother talked about you like an obstacle, not a person. The sentence should not have hurt anymore, but it did. Because even after everything, part of Zella still struggled to understand how people she loved became so cold. Vanessa slowly pushed another document toward her. This matters most. Zella looked down. Trust transfer drafts, property restructuring, future liquidation projections, and one horrifying notation, post-divorce sale recommendation. Projected split, Diane Whitmore Trust / Wesley Harper. Nothing for Zella. Nothing. Despite funding almost everything, tears burned her eyes instantly. Not weak tears, infuriated tears. I gave them years of my life. Vanessa nodded quietly, and they treated it like leverage. The city lights blurred outside while silence stretched between the two women connected by the same man's selfishness. Finally, Zella asked quietly, "Why are you helping me?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. Because eventually I realized something terrifying. What Vanessa's expression hardened. If he could erase you after 6 years of marriage, she swallowed. He could erase anyone. That was the moment Zella finally stopped seeing Vanessa as competition. Because women manipulated by the same man are not enemies. They're survivors, standing in different stages of the same fire. Vanessa stood slowly. I'll testify if necessary. Zella blinked in surprise. You would do that? Yes. Why? Vanessa picked up her purse. Because Diane looked at me the exact same way she looked at you eventually. A pause. Replaceable. Then Vanessa left. Zella remained alone in the booth, staring at the documents spread before her. Proof, evidence, truth. And suddenly she realized something powerful. The Harper family spent years controlling narratives, protecting appearances, managing perceptions. But now the narrative belonged to her. Grace arrived 20 minutes later after reviewing scanned copies of the new documents. For the first time since this began, even Grace looked impressed. Well, she said slowly while sitting across from Zella, now we destroy the entire story they built. Zella looked up. Outside, the rain had stopped, and somewhere deep beneath the grief, humiliation, and betrayal, something dangerous was beginning to bloom. Not revenge alone, justice. Wesley Harper's downfall became public on a Monday morning, not with sirens, not with dramatic headlines, with an email, a quiet internal company memo announcing that Wesley Harper had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending investigation into financial misconduct and ethical violations. Corporate destruction rarely looked cinematic. It looked clinical, cold, carefully worded. But the humiliation spread just as fast. By noon, people in Greenwich were already whispering. By evening, Diane Whitmore's country club friends had suddenly become concerned about scheduling conflicts. And by midnight, Wesley sat alone in the dark penthouse apartment, realizing silence sounded very different once admiration disappeared. His phone barely rang anymore. The same executives who once invited him golfing now responded with legal language and delayed meetings. Even Brandon stopped defending him, especially after Grace Holloway's newest filings hit the court system. Intentional concealment, fraudulent marital misrepresentation, asset shielding conspiracy. The language itself sounded criminal because emotionally it was. Meanwhile, Zella Harper stood inside St. Vincent Medical Center, changing into scrubs for the first time in weeks. The fluorescent hospital lights buzzed softly overhead, while nurses rushed through hallways carrying charts and coffee. Oddly enough, this was the first place she felt safe anymore. Hospitals didn't pretend. People were dying or healing. Nothing hidden beneath polished smiles. Maria, her longtime co-worker, spotted her immediately. Oh my God! Zella barely had time to react before Maria hugged her tightly. You disappeared. I know. Maria pulled back, studying her face carefully. You look different. Zella gave a tired smile. I aged 10 years. No, Maria said quietly. You stopped apologizing. The sentence lingered in Zella's chest long after Maria walked away, because maybe that was true. For most of her marriage, she apologized for existing inconveniently, for being tired, for asking questions, for needing reassurance, for wanting honesty. Now she was done shrinking herself to protect people who never protected her. Later that afternoon, Grace called. You busy? Just finishing rounds. Good. Because Wesley's company froze several accounts. Zella stopped walking. What Grace sounded almost impressed. They found unauthorized transfers tied to marital asset restructuring. A strange ache moved through Zella's chest. Not happiness, just the surreal feeling of watching consequences finally catch up to someone who thought they were untouchable. Also, Grace added casually, Diane's losing control. That got her attention. What happened? She tried blaming you publicly at a charity board meeting. Zella laughed once in disbelief. Of course she did. But then Grace continued. Someone leaked the voicemail transcript. Zella went still. The voicemail. Make sure Zella never receives the closing documents directly. Grace's tone sharpened with satisfaction. Apparently, hearing Diane strategize against her daughter-in-law in her own voice made social support evaporate very quickly. For years, Diane weaponized Image. Now Image was turning against her. That night, Zella drove to the Greenwich property alone, not because she missed it, because she needed closure. The mansion stood enormous against the darkening sky, glowing warmly from inside, while landscapers still maintained hedges and pathways like nothing had happened. Money always tried to preserve appearances. Zella parked slowly across the street. 5 years. 5 years of exhaustion sat inside those walls. 5 years of skipped meals and collapsing into bed after 18-hour workdays. 5 years of believing sacrifice guaranteed security. And now the house looked empty. Beautiful, but empty. Her phone buzzed. Wesley. She considered ignoring it, then answered. What I know where you are. She glanced automatically toward the house. Wesley stepped out onto the front porch moments later. For a second, neither moved. Then he slowly walked toward her car. He looked terrible. Wrinkled shirt, unshaven jaw, dark circles under his eyes, like consequences had finally started eating through the polished version of him. Zella stepped out of the car carefully. Cold wind moved between them. I just wanted to see it one last time, she said quietly. Wesley looked toward the house, too. We can still fix this. There it was again, that delusion. As if betrayal was temporary damage instead of total destruction. No, Zella answered softly. You can't rebuild trust on top of manipulation. He moved closer. I made mistakes. You built systems. His face tightened. Grace is poisoning you against me. Zella almost laughed. Grace didn't make you cheat on me. Silence. She didn't make you hide assets. Another silence. She didn't make your mother treat me like a financial liability instead of a human being. Wesley looked away. That guilt would have mattered months ago. Now it mostly exhausted her. I loved you, he whispered finally. Tears immediately burned her eyes. Because she believed him, that was the tragedy. Wesley probably did love her in the only way he knew how. Possessively, selfishly, conditionally. But love without integrity becomes exploitation eventually. You loved what I gave you, Zella said quietly. That's not fair. No, she whispered. Fair would have been honesty. Wesley stepped closer again. Please, one word, broken, human. And for one terrifying second, Zella saw flashes of their old life. Late night takeout on the apartment floor, Sunday mornings tangled in blankets, the way he kissed her forehead after hard shifts, the future she thought they were building. Grief hit her so hard she physically looked away, because losing someone toxic still hurts when you loved them genuinely. Wesley reached carefully for her hand. I can make this right. Zella slowly stepped backward. No, she said softly. You just finally realized I'm leaving. The truth of that hit him visibly. His expression cracked, not performatively, actually cracked, because men like Wesley often mistake loyalty for permanence. They think good women will absorb infinite damage and still stay, until one day they don't. You're really going to destroy everything, he whispered. That sentence changed something inside her permanently. Destroy. As though she caused this. Zella stared at him for a very long moment, then finally spoke. You know what your mother taught you? Wesley frowned slightly. What? That women are tools. Her voice remained calm now. Ladders, investments, safety nets. That's not true. She taught you to use love strategically. His jaw tightened. And you let her. The wind moved softly through the silence between them. Then Zella said the sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. You used women like stepping stones to build your life, and now you're shocked the bridge collapsed. Wesley looked genuinely wounded. Good. For once, she wanted him to feel the weight of what he had done, not just legally, emotionally. A car suddenly pulled into the driveway behind them. Diane. Of course. She stepped out wearing a cream coat and immediately froze when she saw them together. Then her eyes hardened. Wesley. The tone alone carried control. Ownership. He looked toward his mother automatically, and in that exact moment, Zella finally saw the truth completely. Wesley Harper had never become his own man. He was still emotionally managed by the same woman who taught him that protecting wealth mattered more than protecting people. Diane approached slowly. You shouldn't be here, she told Zella coldly. Zella looked directly at her. For years I thought you hated me because I wasn't rich enough. Diane said nothing, but now I understand. A pause. You hated me because I loved your son more honestly than you ever loved anyone. For the first time, Diane Whitmore had no response. And somehow that silence felt more powerful than revenge. Then Zella turned around, got back into her car, and drove away from the mansion forever. Behind her, Wesley stood motionless between his mother and the empty house that had cost him everything real in his life. Wesley Harper requested the meeting through attorneys. That alone told Zella everything. Not because it was formal, because Wesley only became careful after consequences arrived. Grace read the email silently from her tablet before looking up. He wants a private settlement discussion. Zella sat across from her inside the office wearing navy scrubs after another overnight hospital shift. Her exhaustion looked different now. Less fragile, sharper. What does that really mean? She asked quietly. Grace gave a dry smile. It means he's scared. A strange ache moved through Zella's chest hearing that. Because once upon a time, Wesley Harper feared nothing. Not consequences, not losing her, not even truth. Men protected by wealth and family power rarely imagine collapse until they hear it knocking directly outside the door. Grace slid the tablet across the desk. He specifically requested no court reporters, no media, just the two of you. Zella stared at the email. Her pulse tightened unexpectedly. Part of her wanted closure, part of her wanted answers, and a smaller, more dangerous part still wanted the man she loved to finally say something real. Grace studied her expression carefully. You don't owe him this. I know. Then why are you considering it? Zella looked down at her hands. Because grief is complicated, she thought. Because betrayal doesn't immediately erase love. Because sometimes the hardest person to stop protecting is the one who destroyed you. Finally, she whispered, I think I need to hear him say it. Grace's gaze softened slightly. Say what? The truth. 2 nights later, Zella walked into a private restaurant lounge overlooking the Hudson River. Wesley was already there, and for one devastating second, he looked like home. That was the problem with history. It lingers physically, in familiar eyes, familiar posture, familiar silence. Wesley stood immediately when he saw her. He looked thinner. His expensive suits no longer fit with the same confidence. Stress hollowed his face. His wedding ring was still on. Zella hated herself a little for noticing. You came, he said quietly. I almost didn't. They sat across from each other in tense silence while soft jazz played somewhere in the background. Outside, rain streaked across the city skyline again. Rain had followed the death of their marriage like a witness. Finally, Wesley spoke. I miss you. Zella looked at him steadily. You miss access to me. Pain flickered across his face. That's not fair. No, she said softly, Fair would have been loyalty. The waitress approached briefly. Neither ordered food. Once alone again, Wesley leaned forward. I know I hurt you. You destroyed me. The honesty of the sentence visibly shook him. For years, Zella softened her pain to protect him. Not anymore. Wesley rubbed both hands over his face. My mother got inside my head. Zella almost laughed. She built your head. Silence. Then Wesley whispered, You don't understand what it's like growing up with her. Zella stared at him because part of her actually did understand. Diane Whitmore loved conditionally. Approval had to be earned, maintained, protected. Wesley spent his entire life terrified of disappointing his mother, and eventually he sacrificed his wife instead. She told me marriages fail all the time, Wesley continued quietly. She said protecting assets was practical, so you protected money instead of your marriage. I thought I could manage both. The tragedy was he probably believed that. Wesley had convinced himself he could compartmentalize betrayal, love Zella emotionally, use her financially, please his mother strategically, sleep with Vanessa privately, and somehow keep every version of his life intact. That kind of selfishness always collapses eventually. I loved you, he whispered again. Zella looked away toward the rain-covered windows. God, that sentence still hurt, not because she doubted it, because she believed it, and love mixed with betrayal creates the deepest kind of grief. You don't betray people you respect, she said quietly. Wesley's voice cracked slightly. I was stupid. No, Zella answered. You were entitled. The word landed heavily between them, entitled. To her labor, to her forgiveness, to endless chances. Wesley's eyes filled suddenly. Real tears. I'm losing everything. And there it was, the center of him. Not I destroyed you, not I'm ashamed. I'm losing everything. Zella felt something inside her finally harden completely, because even now, his pain centered himself. What did you think would happen? She asked softly. I don't know. Yes, you did. He looked up slowly. You thought I'd stay. Silence. Wesley looked away first. Exactly. He thought her loyalty was permanent. He thought kindness meant weakness. He thought exhaustion meant obedience. And maybe the saddest part was this: if he had simply told the truth years earlier, she probably would have forgiven him. But manipulation changes love into survival. And once survival begins, intimacy dies. Wesley reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out a folded piece of paper. What's that, a settlement proposal? Zella stared at it without touching it. There it is. His face tightened. What? The real reason you wanted this meeting. That's not fair. No, she whispered again. Nothing about this is fair. Wesley pushed the paper closer. If we settle quietly, this can stop getting uglier. Zella actually smiled then, not warmly, almost sadly. You still don't understand. What? You think the ugliest part is public exposure? Her eyes locked onto his. The ugliest part was what you did when nobody was watching. The words visibly wounded him. Good. For once, she wanted honesty to hurt. Wesley lowered his voice desperately. Please, we can still fix this. Zella stared at him for a very long moment, then finally asked the question living inside her for weeks. When did you stop loving me? The silence afterward felt endless. Wesley looked shattered. I never stopped. Tears immediately burned behind her eyes again. Because that answer was somehow worse. He betrayed her while loving her, used her while loving her, destroyed her while loving her, which meant his version of love itself was damaged. Wesley swallowed hard. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Zella's chest physically hurt hearing it. Because once upon a time, She would have died happy hearing those words. Now they sounded tragic. Then why did you treat me like something disposable? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out because there was no good answer. Finally, Wesley whispered, I got scared. Of what? Losing my inheritance, losing my family, losing everything I built. Zella stared at him quietly, then softly answered, So you sacrificed me instead. The truth settled brutally between them. Wesley broke then. Actually broke. Tears sliding openly down his face now. I'm sorry. And maybe he meant it. Maybe he truly did. But apologies arriving after destruction don't rebuild trust. They only confirm guilt. Zella stood slowly from the table. Wesley panicked immediately. Please don't go. She looked down at him. The man she once would have followed anywhere. The man who once kissed her bruised hands after hospital shifts. The man who taught her what emotional safety felt like before becoming the reason she lost it. I loved you so much, she whispered. His face crumpled completely. And you loved what I gave you. Zella picked up her coat, then delivered the sentence that finally ended their marriage emotionally forever. You were willing to risk losing me because you never believed I'd walk away. Wesley closed his eyes in pain. Too late. Everything inside him realized it too late. Zella turned toward the exit. Behind her, Wesley whispered brokenly, What am I supposed to do without you? She stopped briefly, but didn't turn around, and quietly answered, Figure out who you are when there's no woman left sacrificing herself to protect you. Then she walked out into the rain alone, this time not shattered, just finished. The courtroom smelled like old wood expensive fabric and restrained judgment. Zella Harper sat beside Grace Holloway at the plaintiff's table, wearing a charcoal suit that suddenly felt too tight around her ribs. Not because of fear, because grief had weight, and today she carried all of it into court. Across the room sat Wesley Harper and Diane Whitmore, separated slightly now. That detail mattered. Months ago they operated like a united machine. Now tension existed even in the silence between them. Diane sat perfectly straight in cream-colored designer wool, her expression composed enough to belong in a museum portrait. Wesley looked exhausted. Truly exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes after reputation collapses and denial finally dies. Behind them sat their legal team. Behind Zella sat Grace's forensic accounting specialists, contractor witnesses, and several thick boxes of evidence. Evidence. That word still felt surreal. Because for years, Zella thought love required trust. Now she understood survival required documentation. The judge entered promptly at 9. Everyone rose. The room settled into tense silence. Grace stood first, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Grace Holloway didn't perform emotion in court. She performed precision. Your Honor. She began calmly. This case concerns intentional financial concealment, marital exploitation, and structured asset manipulation carried out over multiple years against Mrs. Zella Harper. No dramatic tone, no theatrics, just facts sharp enough to cut. Across the room, Diane's attorney shifted immediately. Grace continued. This is not simply a divorce involving infidelity. It is a deliberate pattern of deception involving concealed ownership structures, manipulated financial classifications, and coordinated exclusion from marital equity despite overwhelming contribution. Zella felt her pulse hammering painfully. Because hearing her marriage described clinically made everything sound even uglier. Not tragic, engineered. Grace called the forensic accountant first. Charts appeared on courtroom monitors showing financial contribution breakdowns, color-coded timelines, transfer sequences, invoice restructuring. By the end of the first hour, one truth became undeniable. Zella Harper financed the majority of the property. The accountant pointed calmly toward the screen. Based on available records, Mrs. Harper directly or indirectly contributed approximately 72% of liquid capital associated with construction and development expenditures. A murmur moved quietly through the courtroom. Wesley looked down immediately. Diane remained motionless. Grace approached slowly. And legally, whose name appeared on ownership documentation. The accountant adjusted his glasses. Diane Whitmore. Did Mrs. Harper's name appear anywhere? No. Grace nodded once. No further questions. Then came Eddie Morales, the contractor. His rough construction voice sounded strange against the polished courtroom atmosphere. Grace walked him carefully through invoice manipulation requests. Did anyone instruct you to separate payment structures connected to Mrs. Harper? Yes. Who Wesley Harper? Wesley visibly closed his eyes. Grace continued calmly. Did anyone else discuss limiting Mrs. Harper's financial attachment to the property? Eddie hesitated briefly. Then Diane Whitmore. Another murmur spread through the room. Diane's attorney stood immediately. Objection! Overruled, the judge replied sharply. Grace remained perfectly calm. What specifically did Ms. Whitmore say? Eddie swallowed hard. She said the family needed protection. Protection. Always that word. As though Zella had been a threat instead of the person sacrificing everything to build their future. Then came the voicemail. Grace played it without warning. Diane's cold voice filled the courtroom speakers. Make sure Zella never receives the closing documents directly. If she asks questions, simplify things emotionally. The silence afterward was devastating. Not because the evidence shocked people, because manipulation sounds horrifying when spoken out loud plainly. Wesley looked physically ill. Diane remained composed, but only barely now. Grace turned toward the judge. Your Honor, this was not omission. This was intentional concealment. Then finally, Zella herself took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down, not from weakness, from the terrifying vulnerability of telling the truth publicly. Grace approached carefully. Mrs. Harper, she said softly, can you describe your work schedule during the years the property was being developed? Zella swallowed. I worked ICU overnight shifts 4 days a week. I also did freelance bookkeeping and weekend catering. How many hours weekly on average? 70 to 80. Several jurors visibly reacted. Grace nodded gently. And why did you work that much? Zella's eyes filled instantly. Because I thought we were building a life together. Her voice cracked slightly on the final word. Across the room, Wesley stared downward. Grace continued carefully. Did you believe you had ownership interest in the home? Yes. Why? Because my husband told me we were building our dream house. The courtroom fell painfully quiet. Grace paused before asking the next question. Did anyone ever explain that legally you had no ownership rights? No. Would you have continued contributing financially if you had known? The answer came immediately. No. That single word echoed through the room. Grace stepped closer. How did discovering the truth affect you emotionally? Zella looked down briefly, then finally answered honestly. It made me feel disposable. Tears burned behind her eyes now, but she kept speaking. I worked until I collapsed physically. I missed holidays. I skipped medical appointments. I drained my savings. And the entire time, her voice shook. They were structuring everything so I could be removed cleanly. Even the judge's expression hardened slightly at that. Grace's voice softened. What hurt most, Zella looked directly toward Wesley for the first time all morning. He watched me destroy myself for our future while already planning a life without me. The pain on Wesley's face became visible immediately. Good. For once, she wanted him to hear exactly what he had done without being protected from it. Then came Diane's testimony, and everything changed. Diane Whitmore approached the stand with elegant posture and cold composure intact. For the first 10 minutes, she performed beautifully. Controlled answers, strategic language, corporate calm, until Grace Holloway stood for cross-examination. That's when the courtroom shifted completely. Grace approached slowly. "Ms. Whitmore," she began pleasantly, "would you describe yourself as protective of family wealth?" "Yes." "Protective enough to intentionally exclude your daughter-in-law from property ownership despite substantial contribution?" "No." Grace smiled slightly, then projected an email onto the courtroom monitor. The subject line read, "Post-divorce asset security projections." Diane's expression changed instantly. Tiny, but fatal. Grace read aloud, "Once the property appreciates sufficiently, Wesley's transition out of the marriage should remain financially protected." The courtroom went silent. Grace looked up calmly. "Would you like to explain the phrase transition out of the marriage?" Diane's composure cracked for the first time. "That email is being taken out of context." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Of course." Then projected another document, then another, then another. Trust restructuring, asset shielding, discussion of optics, emotional management strategies. Every document painted the same horrifying picture. Zella Harper was never treated like family. She was treated like temporary labor. By the time Grace finished, Diane no longer looked powerful. She looked exposed. Then came the final blow. Vanessa Cole entered the courtroom. Wesley physically froze. Vanessa testified calmly about Wesley's plans to leave the marriage after property appreciation. The affair, the conversations, the discussions about keeping Zella emotionally uninformed. Every word drove the final nails deeper. When Vanessa stepped down, the courtroom felt emotionally exhausted. Grace delivered closing arguments quietly. No screaming, no dramatics, just devastating truth. "Kind women are often mistaken for weak women," she said finally. Mrs. Harper trusted her husband. She trusted her marriage, and that trust was weaponized against her financially, emotionally, and strategically. She looked toward the judge. "Love is not legal immunity for exploitation." Then she sat down. Silence consumed the room. The judge removed his glasses slowly and looked over the courtroom. His expression had changed too, no longer detached, disturbed. Finally, he spoke. "The court will recess briefly before final ruling." The gavel struck. And suddenly, everyone in the room realized the same terrifying thing the Harper family was about to lose. The courtroom did not feel like it was waiting for a verdict anymore. It felt like it was waiting for impact. Zella Harper sat perfectly still beside Grace Holloway, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. She wasn't crying now. That stage had passed long ago. What remained was something quieter, heavier, final. Across the room, Wesley Harper hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Diane Whitmore sat beside him like a statue carved from restraint, but even she no longer looked untouched. Something in her posture had shifted during the testimony, subtle but irreversible. Control always looks perfect until the moment it doesn't. The judge returned. The entire room rose instantly. Zella's heartbeat didn't speed up, it steadied. That surprised her, because once upon a time she thought justice would feel like relief. Now she understood it felt more like closure cutting through scar tissue. The judge sat down, adjusted his papers, and exhaled once before speaking. "I have reviewed the evidence presented." A pause. No one breathed. This case demonstrates a prolonged pattern of financial misrepresentation, intentional exclusion from marital property, and coordinated concealment of assets. Diane's jaw tightened slightly. Wesley lowered his head. Zella didn't react yet, not until she heard the words that actually mattered. The judge continued, "The court finds clear and convincing evidence that Mrs. Zella Harper materially contributed to the acquisition, construction, and financial maintenance of the disputed property." Zella's fingers twitched slightly. Grace didn't look at her, but her voice was almost silent. "That's good." The judge adjusted his glasses again. Furthermore, the court finds that said contributions were knowingly excluded from ownership documentation through coordinated action between Mr. Wesley Harper and Mrs. Diane Whitmore. That sentence landed like a stone in still water. No noise followed it, just pressure. Then the judge delivered the part that shifted everything. As such, the court recognizes Mrs. Zella Harper's equitable claim to the property and associated financial restitution. A sound moved through the courtroom. Not applause, not shock. Something quieter. Realization. Wesley closed his eyes. Diane didn't move at all. For the first time since this began, Zella felt something crack inside her chest that wasn't pain. It was release. Not happiness, not victory, just the ending of a long, suffocating uncertainty. The judge continued outlining financial restitution terms, penalties, and property evaluation procedures. But Zella stopped hearing individual words, because something inside her mind was finally doing what her body had been trying to do for months, letting go. When court adjourned, the sound of chairs shifting filled the room. People began standing, whispering, leaving. But Zella remained seated. Wesley approached first, slowly, carefully, like a man walking towards something he didn't know how to face anymore. Zella. Her eyes lifted toward him, and for the first time she saw him clearly without emotion distorting the image. Not the man she loved, not the man she feared losing, just a man who made choices. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said quietly. Zella stared at him. "That's the problem." His face tightened. "I tried to protect what my mother built." "No," Zella said softly. "You protected what you benefited from." Silence. Wesley swallowed hard. "I lost everything." That sentence again. Always him. Always loss. Zella stood slowly. "Do you know what I lost, Wesley?" He didn't answer. She nodded slightly as if confirming something only she understood now. "I lost 5 years believing I was building a future with someone who was building it around me, not with me." Wesley's voice cracked. "I loved you." Zella looked at him for a long moment, and something inside her finally softened, but not toward him, toward herself. "I know," she said quietly. That confused him, because he expected anger, or breakdown, or collapse. But Zella Harper no longer belonged to emotional reactions he could predict. "I believe you loved me," she continued, "just not enough to treat me like I mattered more than your comfort." Wesley looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't, because for once he had nothing left to reframe. Across the room, Diane stood slowly. She looked older now, not physically, but structurally, like something inside her identity had finally been exposed to consequences it had never accounted for. She approached Zella without ceremony. "You got what you wanted," Diane said flatly. Zella turned toward her calmly. "No." That single word stopped Diane. Zella continued, "I got what was fair." Diane's eyes sharpened slightly. "You destroyed a family." Zella almost laughed at that. For years, Diane used family as a shield. Now it sounded hollow. "I didn't destroy anything," Zella said softly. "I just stopped letting you define my role in it." A pause. Then she added, "You don't get to exploit someone and call it tradition." Diane's expression tightened. For the first time, she had no polished response, just silence. And silence in Diane Whitmore's world was defeat. Wesley stepped between them slightly. "Mom, stop." The tone surprised Zella, not because it was firm, because it sounded uncertain, like for the first time Wesley wasn't sure who he was defending. Diane looked at her son, then at Zella. Then something strange happened. Her control slipped, just slightly. "You think this ends here?" Diane said quietly. Zella didn't react. Diane continued, "You think walking away makes you powerful?" Zella met her eyes calmly. "No," she said. "Healing makes me powerful." That word landed differently, because it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't defensive, it was final. Grace stepped beside Zella, now closing her folder. "We're done here." Diane's eyes flicked toward Grace. "You ruined my family." Grace didn't even hesitate. "No," she replied. "You did that yourself. We just documented it." For the first time, Diane had no counter, no angle, no narrative, just exposure. Wesley looked between all three women like he was standing in a collapsing structure. "Zella," he said again quietly. She looked at him one last time, and this time there was no anger left, only distance. "I hope you learn something from this," she said softly. His voice broke. "Like what?" Zella paused for a moment, then answered, "That love without integrity is just control with better marketing." Wesley closed his eyes and didn't respond. Zella turned away, and this time no one followed her. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, colder, but cleaner. Zella stood still on the steps for a moment, letting the wind hit her face. Grace came out beside her. "You okay?" she asked. Zella thought about it. Honestly, completely, then nodded once. Yes, not healed, not fully, but no longer trapped. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened and closed repeatedly as life inside continued moving forward. But Zella didn't look back. She walked down the steps slowly, not running, not escaping, just leaving. And for the first time in years, she wasn't walking away from something broken. She was walking towards something hers. The coast of Massachusetts didn't ask questions. It didn't care about court rulings, wealth betrayal, or reputation. It only existed. Wind, salt, light, and silence that didn't feel empty anymore. Zella Harper stood on the small wooden porch of her rented seaside cottage, holding a mug of coffee she had actually been able to finish while it was still warm. That alone felt like a small miracle. Behind her, the house was modest. One floor, white-painted wood, a slightly uneven fence. Nothing like the glass and marble world she had left behind. And for the first time in years, it felt like enough. Grace Holloway had called it a recovery space, not a permanent escape. But Zella wasn't thinking in legal terms anymore. She was thinking in breaths. In mornings, she didn't dread. In nights, she didn't collapse into exhaustion. In silence, that didn't feel like punishment. She sipped her coffee slowly, watching waves roll in with steady patience. Her phone buzzed inside the house. She didn't rush to it anymore. That was new too. When she finally checked it, there were no urgent legal updates, no Wesley messages, no Diane Whitmore legal threats, just life slowly reorganizing itself without them. She set the phone down again. Outside, the wind shifted, and then a car pulled up. Zella noticed immediately, not fear, just awareness. A black sedan parked near the gravel path. The engine shut off, and Wesley Harper stepped out. For a second, neither moved. Distance made him look smaller, less polished, less untouchable. He walked slowly toward the porch, stopping a few feet away. Zella didn't speak first. She simply observed him. He looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, the kind of tired that comes from finally living with consequences instead of avoiding them. "I didn't know if you'd be here," he said quietly. Zella took another sip of coffee. "I live here." A pause. Then Wesley nodded slightly. "Right." Silence stretched between them. Not hostile, not emotional, just empty of illusions. Finally, Wesley spoke again. "Things are over." Zella looked at him calmly. "They were over a long time ago." His jaw tightened slightly. "I lost my job." She didn't react. "I know." That surprised him. "You know Grace told me." Wesley nodded slowly like that made sense. "Of course it did." Grace Holloway knew everything that mattered now. Wesley looked down briefly. "Mom's reputation is gone." Zella still didn't react. "And Vanessa?" "She left the city." That one landed slightly differently. Zella remembered Vanessa's voice. Not an enemy, not a friend, just another woman caught inside the same system of manipulation. "I'm not surprised," Zella said quietly. Wesley exhaled, then finally looked at her properly. "I don't know who I am without all of this." The honesty in his voice would have moved her once, maybe even softened her. But that version of Zella no longer existed. She leaned lightly against the porch railing. "That's your work now," she said. He frowned slightly. "You're not going to tell me anything?" Zella shook her head. "No." A pause. "Why not?" She looked at the ocean for a moment before answering. "Because for years I told you what I needed. I told you when I was exhausted. I told you when I was uncomfortable. I told you when things felt wrong." Her gaze returned to him. "And you still chose what benefited you." Wesley flinched slightly. "So what now?" he asked quietly. Zella thought about that. A long time ago she would have answered with emotion, with hope, with fear. Now she answered with clarity. "Now I stop explaining myself." That sentence hit him harder than anger would have, because it confirmed something final. There was nothing left to negotiate. Wesley looked at the house behind her. "It's nice here," he said quietly. Zella nodded. "It is." Another silence. Then Wesley spoke again, voice lower. "Do you ever miss it? The life, the house, the version of them that existed before truth destroyed everything?" Zella didn't answer immediately. She actually considered it and realized something unexpected. She didn't miss the life. She missed who she thought she was inside it. Hopeful, loyal, unaware. "I miss the idea of it," she said finally. Wesley nodded slowly. "That's fair." For once he didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't reframe, just accepted it. That alone felt like a different version of him. Too late. But different. Zella set her mug down on the porch railing. "I'm not angry anymore," she said softly. Wesley looked up quickly. "You're not?" "No." Confusion flickered across his face. "Then what are you?" Zella considered the question carefully. Because it mattered. Because this was the first time someone from that life had asked without trying to control the answer. "Free," she said simply. Wesley swallowed. "And us?" Zella looked at him steadily. "There is no us. There's before. And there's after." The finality of that statement settled into the air between them like a closing door. Wesley nodded slowly. "I deserved that." Zella didn't confirm it, didn't deny it, because assigning moral weight no longer interested her. Justice had already happened. What remained was life. Wesley took a step back, then stopped. "I hope you're happy," he said quietly. Zella looked at the ocean again. "I'm learning how to be." That answer surprised him because it wasn't triumphant, it wasn't broken, it was real. Wesley hesitated one last time, then nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. This time, Zella believed he meant it, but meaning it wasn't enough anymore. "I know," she said gently. Wesley looked like he wanted to say more, but there was nothing left that wouldn't reopen wounds already healed in different directions. So he turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back, and neither did she. When the car disappeared down the road, the silence returned. But it wasn't heavy anymore, it was just present. Zella picked up her coffee again and finally smiled slightly. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was pretending anymore. Behind her, the small house stood steady against the wind. Ahead of her, the ocean kept moving forward without hesitation, and for the first time in her life, Zella Harper wasn't surviving someone else's story. She was living her own. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sea air fill her lungs. No urgency, no betrayal, no performance, just life. When she opened them again, the world was still there, but she was no longer the same woman inside it. She was someone who had been broken and still chose to continue, not as a victim, not as a wife defined by loss, but as herself. And that was the beginning of something that no courtroom, no betrayal, and no family empire could ever take away again. Freedom. Sometimes the most painful truth is not that someone betrays you, but that you trusted them enough to build your entire world around them. Zella Harper's story is not just about a broken marriage or a stolen home, it's about how quietly a person can lose themselves while trying to hold a relationship together. She didn't fail because she loved too much. She suffered because she loved someone who saw her love as something to use instead of something to protect. There is a moment in every person's life when loyalty stops being noble and starts becoming dangerous. Zella reached that moment slowly through exhaustion, silence, and small betrayals she kept excusing because she believed in the future she was promised. But the hardest lesson she learned was this: love without honesty is not love. It is dependency disguised as devotion. And devotion, when one-sided, always becomes self-destruction. What makes her transformation so powerful is not revenge and not even victory in court. It is the moment she stops asking to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. That is where real freedom begins. Not when others apologize, but when you no longer need their apology to move forward. Zella did not become strong because she fought back. She became strong because she finally stopped abandoning herself. She stopped confusing sacrifice with worth. She stopped believing that endurance was the price of being loved. And that is the lesson that stays long after the story ends. The right people will never require you to shrink, suffer, or silently bleed in order to deserve a place in their life. Real love does not ask you to disappear. It helps you become more of who you already are. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever stayed too long in something that required you to lose yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about betrayal, healing, and self-worth. Sometimes the right story arrives at exactly the moment you need to hear it.